All right. So up to this point, we've covered several things. We first discussed Christian theology in general. Then we zeroed in on Protestant theology, and we recognized the fact that there's two epistemic hypotheses regarding sola scriptura. One is the magisterial approach, one is the radical approach. Then I've introduced the Adventist theological method as a solution to the sola scriptura dilemma. How can we do theology with the Bible alone? And that was a very, very long presentation, but I wanted to get everything in there as much as possible. Then we talked about the cosmic conflict, because I needed to make sure people understand what it is, and the fact that it's not an E.G. White construct. It's actually a rational construct that you could build on using biblical elements, and so on. Then we briefly discussed the issue of Ellen White. And what I want to do in this presentation is I want to quickly address several other loose ends, because like I said, I don't want to take the time within this introductory series to give a detailed account of Adventist theology, because it would take too long. So I just want to quickly tie up some loose ends. In the next presentation, I'll give a quick overview of Adventist history, and after that, we can get started with. In fact, I'm going to have some videos on philosophy, like I mentioned, and then we could get started with, addressing specific works by other people that other people have put out, and responding to them. Okay, so one of the distinctives of Adventist theology in general. Now, what I've done so far is talked about kind of the epistemology of the Adventist theology. But now, going further into the actual theology, some of the distinctives are the fact that we take a historicist approach to Bible prophecy, to apocalyptic prophecy. And for people that are not familiar with historicism, it's one of the four schools of interpretation. So this applies to Bible books like the Book of Daniel and the Book of Revelation, and occasionally a few other segments of Scripture as well. Now, the four approaches are either preterism, and preterism is the idea that the apocalyptic prophecies of Scripture were actually referring to things that happened within the first century or so after Christ. So basically, all these prophecies have already been fulfilled 2,000 years ago. So that's one approach, is the preterist approach. Then we have the futurist approach, and that approach says that all these prophecies are going to be fulfilled in the future after the rapture. Usually, they say it's after the rapture. So the prophecies haven't been fulfilled yet. It's something that's supposed to happen. And then another approach is the idealist approach. And this approach says that the prophecies are not predictions of the future or things that happened in the past. They're they're supposed to be taken as spiritual lesson pretty much. So they're not tied to reality. So we shouldn't expect things to be fulfilled. We're just supposed to look at them and take various lessons from them of a spiritual nature. So those are the three contrasting approaches with the historicist approach, which says no, prophecy has been fulfilling throughout history from the time of the prophet that made the prediction all the way to the present. So the historicist approach allows prophecies to kind of slowly take place over time as history progresses. Now, the historicist approach used to be a lot more popular among Protestants. Even at the very beginning of the Reformation, people were using prophecies and applying them to the Catholic Church and things like that. But within the past 100 years or so, this view has been almost universally abandoned by Protestants. There's very few people that still take a historicist approach to Bible prophecy today. Now, when it comes to the sola scriptura model that I'm presenting here, this idea of a true sola scriptura model, I believe that this model is a lot more closely tied with the historicist approach to prophecy than other other theological models might be. And there's several reasons for this. So one reason is a type of epistemic grounding. So for example, when you take pretty much all the other models, because they're not focused on being strictly developed based on scripture, they rely on other sources, whether it's tradition, whether it's philosophy, whether it's science, whether it's other components like this. And because of that, they sometimes rely on those things to justify the credibility of Christian theology. So sometimes people might rely on philosophy. So they might use various philosophical arguments to create sort of a basis upon which to then develop their Christian theology, various types of philosophical arguments. But if somebody is going to do theology and try to do theology within scripture as much as possible, then we need something from within scripture to provide that same kind of epistemic justification. And if we look for that kind of thing within scripture, there's the only thing that it really seems to work for that to accomplish this is this kind of prophetic element. So prophecy seem within the sola scriptura model takes up a role that other components play within other types of theology that are not strictly sola scriptura. So that's one reason for the connection between the sola scriptura model and historicist prophetic interpretation. Another reason is the example of the biblical characters. If we look at how individuals in scripture related to prophecy within their time, they interpret it in the same way that we would if we followed the historicist approach today. Or another way to say this is that if somehow people from the various parts of the Bible were resurrected today, so people like Isaiah or people like the apostles or Daniel or any of those people, if they could be brought back to life today and they were given the Bible, when they read it, they would interpret the prophecies through a historicist lens, because that's how they did it back in their own Bible times. They applied the prophecies historically from the time of the first prophet that made the predictions all the way to their time. Okay, another reason is this paradigm of the cosmic conflict. So within the cosmic conflict, what we understand is that we're here as part of this demonstration and that we're only here temporarily. So we're just here for a limited time, and God has this agenda where he's allowing certain things to happen, and then he's going to put everything to a close, and this period of sin and suffering will be over. So within this context, it makes sense that God would have a certain schedule and that he would reveal that schedule to people, just like he revealed the coming of the Messiah and other things like this. So even the paradigm of the cosmic conflict seems to line up with the historicist approach. Another reason for historicism here is because it justifies the radical Reformation approach to epistemology, because if we look at this chart that I've used in the past, obviously Catholicism believes that they have been following the consistent progression of truth from the time of the apostles all the way to the present. The magisterial reformers feel like there was an apostasy at some point in early history, and all they have to do is go back in time to the first few centuries after Christ and pick up from there, while the radical Reformation goes back all the way to the time of the apostles and even bypasses the church fathers. So this latter hypothesis, this latter view or approach, needs to have a justification for why it bypasses 2,000 years of Christian history. And the historicist approach to prophecy does provide that kind of explanation. It explains how Christian history deteriorated over time, and Christianity kind of moved away from God's plan and things like this. So historicism actually becomes a justification for this latter model and an explanation for why we're going so far back in history um, to recover the truth of Christianity. And finally, another reason for the historicist approach is that it makes the Bible into a living witness. So we've already talked about the fact that the canon of Scripture was closed with after the within the context of the apostolic community. So basically, the last few contributions to the Bible happened while the apostles were alive, and then the canon was closed, and we don't have anything after that. So we might say, well, okay, so that means that Christian theology was more or less completed when the Bible was completed because the document hasn't changed since. But the historicist perspective on prophecy allows for theology to be dynamic even in the future, because as history progresses, then the prophecies are fulfilled. And as we see the prophecies fulfilled, we have an understanding of theology that we didn't have up to that point, and we can actually broaden our theological perspective with the passing of time, even though the canon of Scripture was closed. So historicism provides a pathway for having a dynamic theology, even within the sola scriptura paradigm, where the data with which we do our theology is more or less unchangeable, but because of the unfolding of history and the way, in other words, we don't know how the prophecies are going to be fulfilled a lot of times until they actually happen, and then we understand what the prophecies are saying, and so we could rethink through our theology, and theology becomes a lot more dynamic. Because other models, like for example, the Catholic model will say, well, hey, the sola scriptura is just this dead document that you guys are working on, while we have a living interpreter, a living body that continues to adapt to the changing environment and things like this, and it's a lot more a dynamic theological framework that we have to work with. So this is a way that even the sola scriptura model can be more dynamic in that sense. Okay, so on the other hand, when it comes to the objections that people have against Protestantism, those objections don't work very well with the sola scriptura model. So, for example, one objection is that the church fathers follow this preterist approach, which is obvious because everybody tries to interpret things within their own time frame. So it's only natural that people early in history would have tried to understand the prophecies within their own time. But because the sola scriptura model doesn't rely on the early church fathers the way Protestants do, then that is not really an objection for us. Other objections are things like the historicist approach to prophecy makes room for a lot of abuse, because people can misinterpret prophecies and make predictions. And in fact, the whole 1844 debacle is a good example of what can happen when people follow historicism. However, that's not a good argument, because anything can be abused. I mean, somebody could say, like, look what happens when people read the Bible. They go have crusades, they go do all this stuff. So Christianity as a whole is dangerous or whatever. Just because something can be abused is not a real good argument against it. Other objections are the fact that the people speculate a lot when it comes to historicist prophecy, but that's not something that has to happen. I mean, people don't really need to speculate on things that are not clearly set out. So generally, the objections that people bring against historicism are not that great, or even if there are valid objections, that they don't really apply to the sola scriptura model. So anyway, those are some reasons why Adventists see value in the historicist approach and have incorporated this into our whole theological structure. Okay, so I want to put this here for people that are not familiar with how Adventists interpret prophecy and how we apply the historicist approach to prophecy. This applies to Daniel. So what we do is we take Daniel 2, Daniel 7, Daniel 8, 9, and then Daniel 10 through 12, and we set them side by side as being parallel prophecies, where each prophecy has certain components the other one doesn't, and they kind of complement each other. Okay, so what are the components of the prophecies? So all these prophecies start in Daniel's time. So Daniel lived in the time of Babylon, and Babylon as an empire went from 631 BC all the way to 538 BC. And that's represented in Daniel 2 by the head of gold, and in Daniel 7 by the lion, and in Daniel 8, 9, it doesn't have representation because by this time Babylon had already fallen. So we don't have something there. Then we have Medo-Persia from 538 to 331 BC. That is the chest of silver in Daniel 2. That is the bear in Daniel 7, and that is the ram in Daniel 8 and 9. This is mostly Daniel 8, but in fact, I should explain this, that all these prophecies, Daniel 2, they go from the time of Daniel to the second coming. Daniel 7 goes from the time of Daniel to the second coming. Daniel 8 goes from the time of Daniel to the second coming. This is how Adventists interpret this, and a lot of Christians disagree with us here. And then Daniel 10 through 12 go from there to the end. Daniel 9 is the only chapter that kind of stands apart and doesn't follow this pattern. So because of that, Adventists have viewed these two chapters as needing to be taken together. Even though the visions happened several years apart, but because of the fact that Daniel 9 doesn't follow this pattern, we feel that it makes sense to take these two together. I'm not going to spend a lot of time explaining this, but other Adventist expositors have gone over this quite a bit. Okay, so we've talked about Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece goes from 331 to 160 BC. That's the thighs of brass, the leopard in Daniel 7, the goat in Daniel 8 and 9. Rome is from 160 BC to 395 AD, and that's the iron legs, and it's this sometimes people call it a dragon, but Daniel 7 doesn't give it a name. It's the only animal that doesn't have a name here. And then in chapter 8, this component is represented by a horn. Other Christians believe that this is still referring to the goat, so in other words, to Greece, but Adventists interpret this as applying to Rome. Then we have the divided, so basically the Western Roman Empire, it collapsed around 460 or so AD, and it became the various nations of Europe. And while these various nations were independent of each other, they were kind of kept together by the church. So what we believe is that the iron here and the clay, which is the feet of the statue in Daniel 7, represent the iron represents the various nations of Europe, and the clay represents the church holding them together. Over here in Daniel 7, it's the 10 horns represents the 10 nations of Europe. They're not necessarily 10 nations, but it's a symbolic representation. And the little horn represents the church. And then in Daniel 8, we have a little horn that's similar to the little horn in Daniel 7, but it's actually representing both the Roman Empire and the period of time when the empire collapses, and we have the European nations and the church. So this is kind of a composite horn in Daniel 8. And again, I'm just kind of giving a quick overview of the Adventist approach to these prophecies. Then we have something of an intermediate period, which we can call the time at the end. And after that, we have the second coming. So this intermediate period is not really discussed in Daniel 2. We just have the stone that destroys the statue and becomes a mountain that represents the second coming. In Daniel 7, we have something of a heavenly judgment when all the angels are there and God judges the little horn and so on. And then we have the kingdom, which represents the second coming. And then in Daniel 8, we have the sanctuary, and we have the the horn being destroyed, which represents the second coming as well. So these are the parallel components. I don't get into Daniel 10 to 12 at all because it's very detailed. and it's more than I can get into in a presentation like this. So this is kind of a quick overview of how Adventists approach this. Now, our view of Daniel 2 and Daniel 7 has been shared by other Protestants. It's not something new. There's other people that hold this view, or at least have held it in the past. The problem with Adventists has been with Daniel 8 and the way we take Daniel 8 and Daniel 9. So usually people say that Daniel 8, the little horn coming out of the goat is represents Antiochus Epiphanes, which is one of the Greek kings within the Greek era. And this is where Adventism has kind of had a lot of opposition, and people have said that we're misinterpreting that passage. However, here's the problem with the arguments that most people raise on this point. So the key issue under debate is whether that little horn should be interpreted as Greece, in other words, representing the Greek period versus the Roman period. And what people need to understand is that what we're dealing with here is symbols. So whatever they think the correct interpretation is, they're interpreting a symbol. It's not like the Bible explicitly says the little horn represents Greece or represents Rome or something else. We're interpreting symbols, and because of this, it's a whatever interpretation somebody takes, it's a tentative interpretation. In other words, there's a probability factor there that they could be wrong, however convinced they are that they have the right interpretation. It could either be Greece or it could be Rome, and here's why Rome is a possibility here. It's because of the literary link between Daniel 7 and Daniel 8. There's a little horn in Daniel 7 that's very similar to the little horn in Daniel 8. So because of this, we have three possible interpretations, two of which are fairly widely represented. So one option is to say that the little horn in Daniel 7 represents something different than the little horn in Daniel 8. They're two different entities. And wherever people have interpreted these passages through a historicist lens, there's people that have taken this approach. Another option is to say that the little horn in Daniel 7 represents Greece, and the little horn in Daniel 8 represents Greece, and so does the one in 7. Usually they start from Daniel 8 and then they go back to 7. So either they represent two different entities, that's one option. The second option is that both of them represent Greece. So people say, okay, the one in Daniel 8 is Greece, and because it's so similar to the one in Daniel 7, then the one in Daniel 7 must also represent Greece. And other people say, no, the one in Daniel 7 has to be Rome, while the one in Daniel 8 has to be Greece, because the one in Daniel 7 is part of the fourth kingdom, and because we compare that with the statue in Daniel 2, that's also part of the fourth kingdom, so that's Rome. So they do that. So anyway, there's some people take the both are Greece approach, some people take the one is Rome, one is Greece approach. But if we allow both of these approaches, there's a third approach, and the third approach is that both of them are Rome, and the reason for it is because of the similarities between the two little horns. And we could say, based on Daniel 7, it makes sense that the fourth kingdom is Rome, and that the little horn there represents a kingdom within the Roman context. And because of the similarity with Daniel 8, the one in Daniel 8 should also be taken as Rome. So because those other two, essentially there's three possible interpretations here, and because those other two are valid, the third possibility is also a valid possibility. So in other words, there's multiple ways to interpret the passage, and the Adventist interpretation is one of the three viable interpretations. So because of that, there's no real issue here. I mean, people are welcome to take this as epiphanies. They're welcome to take the Daniel 7 little horn as Epiphanes as well, or they could take it as something else. But the Adventist way of looking at it is just as legitimate an interpretation as the other two, because it's essentially one of the three, and any of them could work here. So there's been a lot of debate, either within an Adventist context, like we have people like this before that have made a big deal about this, and from within outside Adventism, people have written or argued and have done so much in trying to say that Adventists are interpreting this wrong, but there isn't any way to know for sure whose interpretation is correct here because we're dealing with symbols. There's three possibilities, all of them are valid. Adventists are going with one of these possibilities, and the reason is because it fits with the rest of our system. It makes sense within the rest of the logic of how we approach other aspects of prophecy and other aspects of theology, and there's nothing wrong with that. So uh, we're just taking one of the three viable ways to interpret this prophecy. All right, moving on. Another issue that comes up within this context is the fact that a lot of Christians have relied on the meta narrative of the covenants to guide their theology. And the reason is that, Protestantism came out of Catholicism, and Catholicism, the way Catholicism related to the Old Testament rules and regulations and rituals and sacrifices and various requirements, they viewed those as prototypes of the sacraments. So whereas, you have the sacrament of the Mass, in the Old Testament, people did various rituals and different things like that, and they were prototypes. And whereas in the New Testament, you have the priests, in the Old Testament, you had the Jewish priests, and they were prototypes of the New Testament priests, and things like that. So within the Catholic mindset, the rules and regulations of the Old Testament services and the Levitical laws and all these different things were viewed from within the context of the sacraments as a kind of a prototype. But when the Protestant Reformation took place, Protestants tried to move away from sacramentalism because they rejected this idea of an incremental move towards salvation, and they've started to look at salvation as a kind of an on-off switch. Like once you're saved, and that's it, and there's no increments in the process. So in doing this, they needed some explanation for all the Old Testament laws because obviously the Protestants weren't going to go back to sacrificing animals and to going to the temple and keeping all the Levitical laws and all this stuff, but they needed a way to understand why they didn't need to keep those anymore. And they came up with the idea of the covenants, which is an idea that shows up within the New Testament, like the Apostle Paul uses it, and then various parts of the New Testament discuss the gospel from within this context of the covenants. So essentially, the way a lot of Protestants think about the Old Testament rituals is that God had a covenant with the Jewish people where they were required to follow certain things, and it was required for their salvation to follow those things. So just to move my slides here, the Catholic had viewed these things as sacramental prototypes, and the Protestants viewed them through the lens of covenantalism or dispensationalism, where God had a certain contract with the people of Israel when it came to their salvation that's different than the contract he has within the Christian era. However, both of these approaches, or all three of these approaches, if we separate covenantalism and dispensationalism, they're not really needed anymore when we approach scripture from the paradigm of the cosmic conflict, because there's no reason for God to have this kind of contractual agreements for the salvation of different individuals, where he saves some people one way, some people another way. So from within the cosmic conflict paradigm, the covenants are viewed differently. So the covenants become a covenant not with individuals towards their own salvation, but with the whole nation of Israel. So basically, God promised to protect them as a nation if they promise to follow these rituals and to maintain the temple and to preserve the knowledge of God and all these different things as a nation. So the idea of the covenants is shifted here. But when it comes to the salvation of individuals, they're saved just like us. So individuals are saved by grace through faith, just like people in the New Testament were or are. And the people in the Old Testament were saved in the exact same way. Because really, if we really think about it, it makes no sense for anybody to be saved by works. It doesn't matter if they were Jewish or not. Within, if we look at the big picture, why would we think anybody deserves to go to heaven if they're saved by works, regardless of if they lived in the Old Testament? But anyway, without getting into that debate, there was a shift, or because we have this cosmic paradigm now, there's no need to have the covenantalist approach to this topic. So we could look at all these things as symbols. Everything that happened in the Old Testament, all the rituals or the sacrifices, the festivals, all the different things the Jewish people did, the temple service itself was actually just a symbol that pointed forward to some aspect of God's economy or some aspect of God's plan of salvation. Okay, so how did Adventists look at these things? Well, when it comes to the annual ritual of the sanctuary, because the services of the sanctuary were performed within an annual cycle. So it's almost like every year you started over and you followed the cycle, and then you finished it, and then you started the whole thing again. And the way it finished is it finished on the Day of Atonement. So the whole cycle was complete when you got to the Day of Atonement, and then everything started over. And the way Adventists understood this is that the Passover pointed forward to the cross, but the Day of Atonement pointed to this final judgment that we could view as a kind of final assessment. So essentially, if we step back and look at things from this great controversy perspective, what we're seeing here is that God allows this demonstration to take place, and then at some point at the very end of history, where there's been sufficient data collected through this process, then God and all the heavenly intelligences that are observing what's happening here on earth who come together, and they could finally look at this data and say, okay, what are the final conclusions? Who is right, God or Satan? What have we had sufficient evidence that sin is bad and we don't ever want to do this again or take this route again? Is this, are the questions that were raised within this great conflict, have they been resolved? And if so, then we can put an end to history and Jesus can return. And then once Jesus returns, that's it, we're done. We're not going to pick this up again. There's nothing else to discuss. Or, was Satan right all along, or whatever the questions were. There's this sort of final inventory that takes place at the end of this demonstration that God has allowed to take place throughout human history. And part of this final inventory relates to how God works with individuals that are saved or lost. Because in the process of saving individuals, or in the process of determining that somebody's not going to be saved, it is a demonstration of God's love and justice as well. So this idea that Adventists have of an investigative judgment, it's not a standalone idea, but it's something that is part of this process of a final inventory, when all the heavenly intelligences are evaluating the results of this cosmic conflict before the second coming, because this is the second coming is when probation essentially closes and all the decisions are made. And I'm going to come back to this point in another slide. But before we get there, I want to address the question of how it is determined who is saved and who is lost. So we're kind of doing a quick shift in direction here, but we'll come back to this elements in a minute. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about soteriology. So soteriology has to do with how an individual is saved. And if we look at this with a wide lens, like if we look at it in terms of different world religions, you have people in the world that don't believe you need salvation. So, for example, in Buddhism, people are not lost, they just need to improve themselves over time. And obviously, if you're an atheist, you don't believe you're lost because you don't believe God exists. So there's some people in the world that don't believe that they need to be saved. Then you have various groups within various world religions who believe that we're saved by works. So basically, if you're a good person, you're saved. If you're a bad person, you're lost. We might say that's the pagan perspective. Then you have Catholicism that has a kind of a combination of faith and works. So yeah, you're saved by the death of Christ, but also there's things that you got to do to earn your own salvation as well. And there's a lot of new ones here, but I'm just going to quickly kind of pass over this component as is. Then we get to Protestantism, and Protestantism says, no, salvation is by grace through faith. So there's nothing you can do there. You cannot be saved by works in any way. You're saved by grace alone through faith alone. So that's the Protestant view. And finally, you have universalism that says it's all grace and nothing else. You don't even have faith. You don't even need to have faith. Everybody's going to be saved in the end because of God's grace, and that's it. So these are like the broad soteriological perspectives out there. And I'm going to zero in on Protestantism now, because Protestantism, because of its logical, essentially, it has certain logical limitations that kind of force it into a corner. So if you're going to say that you're saved by grace through faith, then you got to explain how some people are saved and some people are lost, because you reject universalism at the same time. So if your works don't save you, what exactly is the basis for God differentiating between the saved and lost? And there's three responses that Protestantism has given to this question. So the first response is Calvinism, which said that people are predestined to be saved and predestined to be lost. So there's nothing they can do in this process. They cannot even choose. God determines who's saved or lost. So that's Calvinism. Then you have Arminianism, who said, no, you have a choice to make if you're going to be saved or you're going to be lost. But then there was another group that is known usually as once saved, always saved, that said that once you make a decision to follow God, you cannot be lost anymore. So you do have a choice. It's up to you to decide whether you want to be saved or lost. But once you've made a decision to be saved, then you're set for good. It doesn't matter what you do after that. You're not going to be lost because you've already made your decision. And this view is in opposition to both Calvinism and Arminianism, because the Arminian view is that you can make a decision to be saved, but then, like, let's say 20 years down the line, if you change your mind, you could turn away from God. So your salvation has nothing to do with your works, but you do have your own decision in the process. You have free will, and your decision is not a work. It doesn't qualify as a work, because you're just choosing whether to accept the gift of salvation or not. The gift itself is entirely of God. So these are the three possible scenarios that exist within Protestant theology and within the wider, all the different soteriological perspectives as well. Okay, so one way to think about this three views within Protestantism. And by the way, these three views they're more or less evenly divided among Protestants. So you have groups like the Reformed Christians and Presbyterians, and groups like that fall under the Calvinist view. You have Baptists and some non-denominationals and other groups that fall within the once saved, always saved view. And then you have, Methodists and Pentecostals and others that fall within the Arminian view. And overall, they're fairly evenly divided among Protestants. So this isn't like one approach is stronger than the other. They're fairly balanced within Protestantism. But I have this graphic here. Just imagine that you have two light switches. So one light switch is whether you have free will at the beginning of your Christian experience to accept Christ or not. And then another light switch is whether you have free will at the end, where you say, yes, I'm going to continue to stay with Christ, or I'm going to turn away from Christ. Okay, so if we turn off both of those light switches, that means you don't have free will at all. So that represents Calvinism. If we turn on the first light switch, so you have free will to accept Christ, but then you don't have free will to reject him at the end of your life if you change your mind, then that represents once saved, always saved. And then if we turn on both of these light switches, you have free will at the beginning and you have free will at the end to turn away if you want to. That represents Arminianism. So these are three possible perspectives in Protestantism. Okay, so based on everything I've said before on this within this whole covenantal structure and the way Adventists interpret the covenants and the Old Testament rituals, we have this additional component because we follow the Arminian perspective because that's the only perspective that lines up with the cosmic conflict paradigm. But because we also believe, because we're physicalists and we don't believe that people go to heaven or hell immediately when they die, so essentially they rest in their grave. So one way to say this is soul sleep, but it's a little bit of a misnomer for Adventists because we're physicalists. But it's this idea that people don't go to heaven immediately when they die, or heaven or hell. And because we have Arminianism and we have the soul sleep perspective, when you put those two together, you end up with the investigative judgment idea. Because other Arminians also have a type of investigative judgment, but for them it happens when people die. So when you're dead, God has to decide whether you stuck with your decision to follow Christ or whether you walked away from Christ. And based on that, God decides if you go to heaven or hell. Well, for Adventists, that's not necessary because people are just in their grave when they die. So the judgment, the investigative judgment we have happens at the end of history. And it happens within this context of this wider evaluation for the entire cosmic conflict that I mentioned earlier. Okay, so I want to give a brief overview of how Adventists view the end times so that it kind of, it's easier, it will be easier for people to make sense of the Adventist perspective when it comes to some of the other elements I've discussed before. So basically the way Adventists view the end is that Jesus returns at some point in history within, hopefully the near future. And when Jesus returns, there's no more probation. In other words, people don't have second chances after that, like they do with the rapture theory, where you have 7 more years. Essentially, Jesus comes and that's it. You don't have a second chance during the 1,000 years. Basically, the 1,000 years has a very different purpose in the Adventist view. So there's no more second chances. So probation more or less ends when Jesus comes. The second coming of Christ is premillennial. So it happens before the millennium. And again, there's no rapture. So there isn't this 7-year tribulation period. We're actually pre-trib. So Jesus comes. No, I don't even remember how those things are classified. Basically, the tribulation happens before the second coming and then the second coming. So I guess we're post-trib in that way. But because we don't have a rapture and then a second coming, we just have the second coming and that's it. Pretty much within Christian academia, like at the scholarly level, almost nobody takes the rapture theory seriously. So that's not really an issue for us. Okay, so at the second coming of Christ, we have the resurrection. So all the people that were faithful to Christ throughout their lives, all throughout human history, are resurrected when Jesus comes. And the people who are alive are still alive when Jesus comes. They are transformed. Just like Paul talks about how in the twinkling of an eye at the last trump, they are given a new body. So they experience a transformation. All the evil people that are alive when Jesus comes are slain. So essentially they all die. And then all the faithful that are either alive at the second coming or are resurrected, they're taken to heaven with Jesus. He went to prepare a place for us, prepare rooms for us, prepare mansions for us. There's various translation of those passages in John. So we're taken to him to heaven after the second coming. Okay, so then there's 1,000 years, and there's several things that happen. So during this 1,000-year period, on earth is just complete desolation. Everybody's dead. There's nothing going on here. And Satan is more or less has nothing left to do, nobody left to tempt. But in heaven, there's a kind of evaluation period that's for humanity when we have plenty of time to look at the big picture, to understand what's going on, to we have our chance to understand the cosmic conflict and all the issues, just in the same way that other intelligent beings have been able to do throughout human history, but which we never had a chance because we're in the middle of it. So that's the point of the 1,000 years from our perspective. And then finally, after the 1,000 years and after we've had plenty of time to resolve all the issues for ourselves, there's a return to this earth. There's the final judgment. All the wicked are resurrected again, and they face their judgment. There's a punishment of the wicked, and the punishment is annihilationism. So we believe that we don't believe in eternal conscious torment in hell, where people are suffering for the rest of eternity. There's some kind of punishment that takes place, and probably the people that are the most evil are going to be punished the most. And Satan himself is going to be punished probably more than anybody else. But at some point, the punishment is completed, and then those beings are annihilated, and they cease to exist. And again, the rationale for this, besides the fact that there's a scriptural basis for it, but it's also the fact that we're physicalists, and it's usually people that believe in the soul that have to explain what happens to the soul, and they're the ones that usually feel the need to have a permanent place for the wicked, where they're tormented and tortured because they need to, the soul in their mind is not able to die. So yeah, since we don't have that element, we don't need to postulate that the idea. So once all the wicked are destroyed, we have the new heavens and the new earth according to Revelation, and then after that, we continue to live out here for eternity on the earth made new. So I wanted to give this quick overview just in case somebody's not familiar with Adventist theology, so they could understand our view of the end, and then put the pieces together with some of the other components if they're trying to make sense of them. And I'm pretty sure that it's not sufficient to paint the full picture for people that are really not familiar with our point of view, but hopefully at least it will provide some direction. And there are plenty of Adventist materials everywhere that people can pick up to get a more detailed explanation. Okay, so now I want to give an overview of history from the Adventist perspective. So basically, if we look at the past 2,000 years, we have the apostolic times, sometime within the 1st century AD. Soon after that, there's the falling away. Sometime after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, we have the rise of the church hierarchy. So first we have the conversion of the empire under Constantine, and over time, the empire collapses. Then the church becomes this sort of powerful political entity that becomes kind of an oversight or authority figure over Western Europe. And these things start to develop sometime in around 500 AD, all the way to the late 1700s. Now, within the prophecies of Daniel and Revelation, there's a period of 1,216 days. And as Adventists, we take the days to mean years. And there's various reasons for that we can get into, but I don't want to spend too much time on them. So there's this period of 1,260 years that is repeated 7 different times throughout Daniel and Revelation. So I think it shows up maybe 3 times in Daniel and 4 times in the book of Revelation or something like that, where the same period keeps popping up. And I'll propose that the reason for this is that this period is emphasized. The repetition is there as a way of emphasis, because this becomes an anchor point for all these prophecies. So this period of time of church apostasy, which can be traced somewhere within the 4th century, or what would you call it? I think it's the 4th century, all the way to the 18th century or so. It becomes this period of 1,260 years. Now, a lot of times when Adventists present this, they give very specific dates, like 538 to 1798. I personally don't think those dates are necessary, because the 1260 is a symbolic number. It's symbolic not in the sense that it doesn't represent an actual period of time, but symbolic in the sense that it's a number that keeps repeating over and over throughout scripture. So, for example, uh, Elijah spent 3.5 years, running away from Ahab, and there was that famine for 3.5 years. Then you have the week, and 3.5 days are half of a week. The ministry of Jesus seems to have lasted about 3.5 years. So it's a period that seems to occur multiple times in scripture. And then when you apply the day for a year principle, it becomes 1260 years. But we don't need to take it as a precise number in terms of like, okay, it starts exactly here and it ends exactly there. It's just a period of time that more or less matches history, in the sense that you could see the rise of Catholicism somewhere in the early 500s, and then a collapse in its political authority in the late 1700s. So what we're talking about here is when the church became established as a powerful entity among the various states. Okay, so sometime after this 1260 years, we have the beginning of the Day of Atonement, or the cleansing of the sanctuary, which is a kind of a synonymous concept that we work with. So that had to happen sometime in the early 1800s, because the other one finished in the late 1700s. This is kind of how we get to the 1844 date. Even if the year is not precise, it's somewhere within this time frame. And what this marks is the beginning of this final period, this final inventory, when all of the intelligent beings in heaven are finally looking at this cosmic conflict and making their final decisions as to what was accomplished, and whether God was able to prove his case, whether Satan is able to provide any more counter arguments. Essentially, they're settling the whole conflict. They're coming to their final conclusions. So this is kind of the wide lens overview of history from the Adventist perspective. And the idea here is, we have this period of apostasy of 1260 years in the middle of history here. And the idea is that it is a demonstration of how humanity reacts to the gospel. So in other words, humanity is lost. We're headed for damnation. We're pretty much lost in sin, and God in his love sends his son to come here and live among us and gives his life for us. And then the apostles take this message and preach it everywhere, and more and more people accept it. But at some point over time, Christianity changes and it becomes something negative. And by this point in history, Christianity becomes a way to take control of civilizations, to oppress people. It becomes something negative, and basically, this is the effect of, or the results of what humanity does with something as powerful as the gospel of Christ. So we're able to take even the most the best things and pervert them and use them for evil. And this is part of this demonstration. This is part of so to say this differently, somebody might say, well, why didn't God finish history after Jesus came and died for us? Because, he paid the punishment for sin. Things could have been over right there and then, and we didn't have to have another 2,000 years of history. But this is part of this demonstration. The effects of the gospel and the effects of Christianity on the world needed time to develop, and it turned out to be something negative because humanity perverted the Christian story. Okay, so then once we move from Daniel to Revelation, and I was focusing specifically on Revelation chapter 12, 13, and 14. the way Adventism sees history unfolding is that the Reformation was actually an attempt to have a correction of the trajectory that was taken by Catholicism. But at some point in history, Protestantism more or less changes directions and starts going back to the Catholic way of doing things. And the reason is kind of like we said earlier, that when Protestantism went back in history, and they said, okay, we're going to go all the way back to the church fathers, they didn't go back far enough, and there were certain elements that they've taken up within that the mindset of the early church fathers that over time will develop into something similar to Catholicism. Kind of like if somebody has a brain cancer, so the surgeons go in to remove the tumor, but they don't cut all the way. They're not able to remove the entire thing, and then the cancer kind of comes back. So what I'm saying here is that this is how it seems to us that the prophecies are unfolding if we follow this approach to prophecy consistently through the books of Daniel and the books of Revelation. And the reason is because the book of Revelation has this second beast that shows up. So you have in Revelation 13, you have a beast that comes out of the sea, and there's a lot of similarity between this beast and the beasts of Daniel 7 and Daniel 8. So we could say, okay, they both represent the same entity, but then you have a second beast that comes up around the time of when the first beast is starting to lose its influence. And historically, this seems to represent Protestantism on the religious side of things, and then the discovery of the Americas on the secular side of things, or the civil side of the issue. So you have church and state. On the state part of things, you have America developing, and on the religious side of things, you have Protestantism. And then in the end, they all kind of join forces back together, and they end up following a similar trajectory. So what are we saying by this? We're basically saying that the tendency of the Catholic Church, if it has the capacity or the ability to do so, which it had during the Dark Ages, it's to force its perspective on humanity, if it could. So for much of that period of history, that 1,000 something years, the church more or less pushed its view of reality on the world, and people just had to live within that paradigm and take it as truth. But then when Protestantism came, it kind of opened things up, and then we've had a sort of freedom where humanity was no longer forced to live within that kind of mentality. But it seems that eventually Protestantism has developed to something that is going to become very similar to the Catholic Church of the Dark Ages. And these two entities are going to join forces, and it's not going to happen under normal circumstances. It's going to happen during a time of crisis. So basically, the Bible predicts that at some point in the future, we're going to experience some kind of crisis that is pretty major, a lot bigger than anything we've experienced so far as a human race. And within this time of crisis, the way people are going to react is that religious people from both the Catholic and the Protestant perspective are going to join together and join forces with the state, and they're going to start forcing their point of view, their religious point of view on society, just like they were doing during the Dark Ages, and just like some other nations around the world are doing today, people from other religions. So there's certain countries in the world where the religion of those people is the religion of the state, and everybody there is forced to live by the religious rules of that society. What we're predicting based on our understanding of these prophecies is that when a time of crisis comes up, that's how Protestantism and Catholicism is going to react. And they're going to enforce a similar situation on society here as well. And to some degree, we could see this already. I mean, like if we follow uh, um, how evangelicals are involved in politics today, things like, you know, the fight against abortion, the fight against gay rights, is essentially an attempt to push people's religion down everybody else's throat. So, you know, you have, you know, anybody is perfectly justified in saying they don't believe in abortion, they don't believe it's good to kill an infant, but the only way they could justify forcing everybody else to believe that same thing is by forcing them to embrace your religious presuppositions. It isn't some kind of secular morality here that you can appeal to. It's just your own religious point of view, and it's something that is being imposed on the rest of society, whether it's abortion, whether it's gay rights, or a series of other things. So this phenomenon of forcing religion on the public, we can already see today as something that's being done by the conservative Republican evangelical side of the country, or to say that the evangelical world is heavily involved in right-wing politics, and they're already exhibiting this kind of behavior. It's nothing near what it will be if we reach such a time of crisis as described in Scripture, but that's essentially where it seems to us as Adventists that the logic of the prophecies as they unfold from Daniel going into Revelation, it seems that that's what they're predicting. And this is not to say that all Catholics and all Protestants are going to take this approach, or they're going to be following this pattern, but as systems of or theological models, it seems that this is where they're headed, because they're operating with the same basic premises. They have very similar philosophical paradigms that they're building their theology on. So again, this is similar, you know, going back to this chart, you know, if the radical hypothesis, you know, the radical approach to sola scriptura is correct, then the prediction we're making based on prophecy is that the magisterial approach will eventually turn around and go back and join with the Catholic approach. So basically, to whatever degree they parted ways, they're going to retrace their steps and go back. Not that they're going to agree on everything theologically, but they're going to have a very similar perspective about the role of religion in the world and what they need to do to kind of force everybody else to follow suit. All right, so I know that I've covered a lot of stuff here, and it's not well explained in the sense that there's a lot more that can be said about each one of these elements. But I wanted to quickly cover some of this stuff, just in case it might help somebody to put some loose ends together. And after this, I guess we can always go and discuss it further if needed. But yeah, so this is kind of a final putting together some of these last components here that people might have questions on.